It's my camera. Thank you. www.metropoletv.co.ke. We are live online at Metropole TV KE across all your social media platforms. My name is Elijah Charles Caregiver. Just joining us, you're watching Metropole Television, and this is your economic review, where we get to tell you exactly the biggest headlines that you are waking up to this morning. All right, let me introduce the gentleman who are going to take us through our economic review this morning. We're joined by George MUNGA. George, good morning, sir. How are you doing?
Morning, Elijah. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Hopefully it's going to be happy. It's raining in January.
Correct. Gonna be.
We're also joined by Justin MWANGI, who's an investment analyst, CYTONN. Justin, good morning, sir.
Morning, Simba. How are you?
Fantastic. All right, let's get into that conversation therefore. It seems that Kenyans will have to wait a little longer to truly know what is included in the standard gauge railway contracts after Transport Principal Secretary Dr Joseph Njoroge insisted that those were no disclosure clauses in the agreements entered between the government and the Chinese contractors over the construction of the 450 billion shillings SGR. This follows a petition from two activists, Ms. Wanjiru, Gikonyo, and Khelef, Khalifa, acting as petitioners, requesting to be supplied with the contracts. Dr. Njoroge has further indicated that if the orders sought are granted, it would endanger national security and injure foreign relations between the states that the country has entered into bilateral agreements with, and would stifle the successful implementation of the transport policy. The PS says that the respondent's discretion not to disclose the documents sought is constitutional and protected by sections under 610 and 20 of the Access to Information Act, since the disclosure is likely to undermine national security. Dr. Njoroge further states that terms in the contract touch on foreign government information with implications on national security and foreign relations. The PS also says that if the disclosures is likely to cause substantial harm to the ability of the government to manage the economy of the country in the event of breach of terms of the agreements with foreign nations or corporations. Now, the petitioners want all the contracts, agreements, and studies related to the construction and operations of the SGR made public, arguing that keeping the documents confidential violates the law and discourages transparency in governance. The case will be mentioned on March 31st. Fantastic. Without really mentioning what that case is, let's look at exactly how SGR has been performing, and we're going to look at all the way to 2020, because we do know 2020 was the year that majority of businesses were affected by the coronavirus pandemic. And if we look at passenger revenue and freight revenue, you could see exactly how passenger revenue was impacted heavily by the coronavirus pandemic. But of note is that none of that has touched the 12 billion running revenue for SGR in one financial year as well. Same thing from 2018 to 2020, we've still not touched the 12 billion that SGR needs to be run in a year. So still not cut even as we speak to date. Fantastic. George, let me open this conversation with you this morning. I mean, the conversation of SGR and the contracts of SGR, without mentioning that case that we do expect to be mentioned again on a 31st. Why are these contracts confidential, George? And is it a normal thing that governments will sometimes get into contracts of this nature?
let me put it this way. There's what we call government-to-government transactions, or rather bilateral contracts, and the SGRs falls into that phase. You cannot discuss the SGR contract and leave out the Access to Information Act 2011.
Yes.
The two must go hand in hand. In as much as there is the non-disclosure agreements that sometimes government to government agree on, but remember, it's a public utility facility, and therefore the Kenyan public has the right to know the details of this contract from beginning to end. If the CS comes and says that there are non-disclosure agreements that will injure our relationship with China, that doesn't allow him to disclose the details of this contract, then I think that contravenes the essence of our 2010 constitution. Remember, we had the same issue with Eurobond sometimes back, Elijah.
Yes.
When some parties queried the details of those transactions, and the government was not willing to give details until they were seriously pressurized. So to me, I think the government should come out clean and tell us what are the details of this contract. If there were non-disclosure agreements, then how can we go around those non-disclosure agreements so that we can know as a public what went into this contract? Because remember, when a CS or when a government functionary signs up this contract, they are not signing them off as individuals. They are signing them off as the representatives of the government, and the government is a representative of the people. And therefore, the principals in those contracts are the citizens of Kenya.
Yes.
And the government has the moral obligation to supply or to give as much information as they can regarding some of these contracts. I know the way China government deals with most governments, especially in Africa, sometimes is quite opaque, and they love treating them that way for reasons better known to them. But as a public, Elijah, the government owes us an obligation to give us the details of this contract from end to end, and the Constitution allows us, or the Constitution requires, that government supplies that information as and when a citizen requires to know what went into those contracts.
Pretty much. George, I'll be coming back to you on that as well. Justin, I also want you to weigh in on this particular issue. Justin, it's the biggest project that the Kenyan government has ever gotten into with any other government. To be specific, 450 billion shillings. If you look at our debt repayment portfolio, Justin, China takes 60% of our external debt, and this figure just came to materialize the other day when our debt repayments, because of this SGR loan, came due. When you look at this, the intensity and the size of this project, is it okay for the government to argue this is a non-disclosure agreement between the government of China and the government of Kenya?
No, it's not okay. I totally agree with my colleague. As you said, when the government was signing this contract, it was signed on behalf of the citizens of Kenyans. If this, because it's a loan that was given to us, how are we going to pay it back? It's the government, but through taxpayers' monies. So it's up to the public interest that the government shares as much information as possible about this project, because everything around this project directly affects citizens. How we pay for it, in the worst case scenario, in case there's some sort of security or asset that's been tied to it, it's going to be a public asset, which is going to again directly affect the people. So as a government, you can't enter into an agreement on behalf of your citizens and then come back around after you've already received all these monies, you've done the project, and say, oh wait, this agreement I signed on behalf of you, I'm not going to give you any more information other than the amount.
Yes.
And I'll keep giving you small crumbs of financial updates when I want to and when I feel like it. No, that's not how it's supposed to operate. So I don't think it's okay. I think the fact also you mentioned it covers for over 60% of our bilateral debt, then increases its importance. So you cannot come back and say, as a government, that I'm going to deny you some information. It just causes anxiety, to be honest. It makes you wonder, why would the government be hesitant to share information attached to this contract?
Pretty much. Justin, I'll also be coming back to you on that as well. So let's look at the specifics then, George, of what we know to be SGR. 450 billion shillings, that's what we do know, and the amount of money that SGR requires to be run in a year, we do know it's 12 billion, but what we do know is that 2018 to date, SGR has not even broken even. Even as we repay this loan, we have to look for extra monies to pump into SGR to let it be operational. That's another as well. So George, is that enough information that the government would give to Kenyans? Because it looks as if they have told us how much this project costs. That is in the public domain. They have told us how much SGR is making. They have told us how much we are paying as pertains this SGR debt. Should that be enough for us?
Elijah, there's only one institution in Kenya that is allowed to operate as opaque as SGR. That is the NIS, because of security reasons.
Yes.
Any other institution in the country owes the citizenry what we call an open information policy, and that applies to SGR. If you look at the cost of construction for SGR, it is one of the highest in the region, at 8.2 million USD per kilometer, coming to around 450 billion Kenya shillings. That was very high compared to what has been done in the region. And those are the telltale signs why the government is very hesitant in disclosing the details of this contract. Elijah, to date, you don't know how much. There's a little bit of information here and there of how much SGR makes in a financial year.
Yes.
Like the latest we have is what they made for 6 months to 30th June 2021. That was around 8 billion Kenya shillings. You don't know how much is the cost, and then you don't know how this money is applied. Does it go to central bank? Does it go to the ministry? Does it go to the Chinese? How much of our debt is still owing? How much have we paid so far? How are the repayments? Those are the details that I think the government owes this the citizenry, so that the citizenry can know. Remember, this project was conceived in the Kibaki government, but was implemented in the Jubilee government. But the loan will be rolled over to the next regime that is coming in after August 9th. And therefore, we need to know, as we inherit this debt from the current government, what are we getting ourselves into? What are the obligations that the country has? Remember, the way the Chinese government operates, is sometimes they will come and put in a mega project in the country, especially for the less developed countries or the emerging markets. And the clause is such that if you don't repay the loans that are tied to that project, then they take over that project as their own. And I want to guess that maybe that is the case for SGR. I'm just guessing, because we don't have the facts, and we don't want to reach there as an economy. Remember, Kenya is one of the biggest economy in East Africa, and if we have to go that direction, then we will give pointers to our neighbors, and maybe China will run amok in the region. Therefore, in my opinion, Elijah, I think the government owes us explanations or information,
yes,
on how some of these projects were conceived, how much was the loan, how much has been paid so far, what are the revenues that we are earning from this project, and how those revenues applied. Without that information, Elijah, one day you might wake up and you are told that China government, God forbid, has taken over SGR, and we no longer have any stake in that project, Elijah. And you don't want to.
Yes. Now, I'll be coming back to you on that, George, on the efficacy of the SGR, because we've seen a lot of people try to defend it in different formats. Justin, let me pick with you on that as well. The efficacy of SGR. I mean, we've seen the government defend it in different formats. Justin, is it about time now that we question then why this country indeed, in the first case, needed SGR, or you belong to that side of the conversation that says, well, let's look at the accruing investment opportunities and the growth of the economy that SGR brings to this country, other than just what we get from SGR?
I wish I belonged to the latter side that you just mentioned, but in all honesty, this is something that should have questioned way before during the Kibaki government. The moment this project was mentioned and figures were quoted, in fact, the figure was a bit low, but it was still significant.
Yes.
If you're looking at $300 billion shillings for 50 billion shillings, that's a lot of money. Our budget for full year is about 2 trillion. So you're talking about a quarter of a budget in terms of the loans to fund just one project. Again, you look at what was this project supposed to do? Were we relying so much on train transport that if we upgraded the train transport, we'll have a significant improvement in government revenues? The simple straight answer is no. And once they implemented it, then the optimist in me was there are going to be so many measures put in place, and also so many incentives for businesses, especially the long haul truckers and people who provide goods across East Africa, so that they may use this SGR and not forcing their hand, as we saw about in 2017 when it was being launched. But up to date, we are seeing that this project, it's going to be very hard to argue for its viability case. If you look at the revenues, you could argue they are stable right now, in that hitting about 1 billion, 1.3 billion there every month, cost of about 800 million. But if the project itself, if you look at how a business runs, you take a debt, based on the revenues of that business, you're supposed to repay a particular debt.
Yes.
But this type of debt is whereby we have to repay about 20-something million every year. 20-something billion every year. This project is generating less than about 12 billion every year. That's revenue only. If you look at the net position, that diminishes drastically. It goes to about 6 billion every year. So this project itself cannot repay its financing cost. Then what happens? It has to go back to the taxpayers.
Yes.
It's the government coffers that we have contributed to, all of us taxpayers. We even seen it going to the extent whereby the government is dipping into its own forex reserves in order to pay these loans. That directly affects the shilling, affects every other aspect of the economy, including how expensive imports are, just because of these huge debts that were taken. Now, if there were signs whereby we are seeing the government says, this year our target is 2 billion per month, as you said, and we have reached 80%, these are the measures to increase it to 100 or even surpass or to perform, and we can see it actively, then we will say, okay, fine, maybe it was too expensive, but we are seeing this a way in which we're going to recover our money and start making profit there afterwards. But at the moment, we're not seeing that. From the fact that the contract itself is a bit vague and opaque, to also the fact that we're not seeing enough detailed terms of the financial reporting, we're not seeing enough detailed terms of the strategy going forward. We have seen such strategies from different parastatals, even things like KRA, whereby they put in a corporate 3-year corporate plan. We should see such things also from SGR, and it be so clear and open and available to the public that we are all in this together.
Pretty much. Now, George, also weigh in on that as well, because that's exactly where I wanted you to begin from. I mean, you see what Justin is saying, in the business of business, if you take out a loan, then it should be able to repay itself. But then we've seen the government take different arguments around this. They're saying, well, don't look at SGR on just part and part, what it takes in and what it puts out. We should also look at the economy that we've created out of SGR. George, is that enough? And now, looking at that, the questions that Justin is putting to the fore right now, does it mean that we got it wrong from the get-go to the point that now you suspect that we knew we were going to get it wrong? That's why some of those contracts were going to be non-disclosure, George.
Elijah, if you piece together the little information that we know about the financials of SGR,
yes,
then you realize that the firm or the company has not broken even, meaning that its cost, its running costs, far outweigh its revenues to date, and that is a worrying trend. And as Justin has said, for a government project of that nature, if the running cost is higher than the operating revenue, then government must find other ways and means to finance their costs or to repay their loans. And therefore, you'll find that government must now go back to its exchequer to be able to draw from the exchequer to pay those loans. That is not a very good pointer, or that's not a very good scenario that you want to be in, especially for a project of this nature. If you look at the socio-economic impact of this project in the Kenyan economy, Elijah, you remember that the government had insisted that all cargo that comes from Mombasa all the way to Nairobi that has to be evacuated through SGR. It was meant to the rate of SGR so that at least it could break even, but that has not happened. And what that did to the other operators in that industry is that it literally killed those other players, and that essentially means that those players cannot now employ people, and they cannot now pay taxes back to the exchequer. So in short, Elijah, in the short run, SGR is a project that is not feasible in the short run. Maybe it will be feasible in the long run, as I think the president had alluded sometimes back. Maybe in the long run it will be feasible. Yes. Remember, the initial plan was that the Kenyan SGR was to run from Mombasa to Malaba, and then it connect to the Ugandan SGR, which runs now from Malaba all the way to the border with Rwanda. With Rwanda, and then Rwanda will pick it up, so that we have what we call a Silk Road all the way from Mombasa maybe to Kinshasa. That would make a lot of sense, because that essentially will mean that all cargo in that corridor will be evacuated through the SGR. But when it terminated at Nairobi, Elijah, then that killed the feasibility of that project also. So in the short run, Elijah, what I can say is that that project is what we call a money sucker, or it sucks money from the economy without giving back. But in the long run, maybe, Elijah, then the project might be feasible. But that will depend on how the next government does with what we really have. If it was to be extended, and then we negotiate with Uganda to again do their bit, then maybe it might be feasible. But as it is now, it is not, Elijah, unfortunately.
Pretty much. Gentlemen, I beg that we move on to the next issue that we have for you this morning. Now, Communication Workers Union has called for the dissolution of the Poster Board. The Communication Workers Union is now calling on the government to bail out the Postal Corporation of Kenya amid several other changes to save it from collapsing. The union, KOBU, which is affiliated to KOTU, also wants the number of general managers reduced as a cost-cutting measure, and the Poster Board dissolved for what it says is failure to deliver positive results. According to KOBU Secretary General Benson Okwaro, the parastatal has struggled to break even for the past 7 years, hence the need for action. Posta is among parastatals that have remained on the National Treasury's bailout list amid rising competition in the market. Out of the 623 outlets Posta has across the country, over 250 are struggling to sustain operations. There have been proposals to merge or restructure struggling state agencies. Changes Treasury is expected to make in the short term. Good. Now, Justin, same conversation really on how the government is struggling to do business. That's the business of business again, if that's the term that we're going to use this morning. Justin, let me begin with this question. It is 2022. We have a government that has a lot of struggling state parastatals. Should the government be in the business of business, or should they give up already?
It's a very broad question. It's basically asking if all parastatals should be privatized or not. And the answer is not very straightforward. Some of these parastatals are better off at the hands of the government. Something like, for example, power delivery to our homes. They are better off at the hands of government. Maybe they already have very high cost of capital that even if we left it to a private player, it would be very hard for them to maintain that business. Now, just focusing on the Postal Corporation of Kenya, and unlike SGR, this time it's not entirely the government's fault, because it's mostly because of the digitization, automation, and how the world has quickly moved on from where it was in the previous century to where we are at now. Remember?
Yes, Justin, would you say that the failure for Posta to also adapt within that change is also the failure for the government? I mean, if you're in the business of that business and other entities around you are also morphing into these new phases that we're seeing now, then you should be blamed for that as well.
I agree. My point was, it's not purely because of the government's fault.
Yes.
The main failure of the government has been, as you say, the failure to adapt quickly enough to this change in times.
Yes.
And this is something that we have seen in many other government-controlled postal corporations all over the world. All the government processes, all the bureaucracy means that it cannot effectively compete with a private player who's purely driven by profit, who's purely driven, and they can control most everything. And they're all after innovation. Now, to a government body that has all these systems in place, land, property all over the country, and they have to ensure that those assets make sense to do a business that is increasingly becoming more and more wireless, then you understand the challenges that they may face moving onwards. However, that is not to exonerate them altogether. As you say, they haven't adapted quickly enough. Once in a while, you hear there's a deal, a certain company has come in, a technology firm has given them some money, and they are entered to a deal in order to be able to deliver some of the goods from outside the country, which is all good. There is some effort in that direction, but not enough.
Yes.
Then you take into account the fact that this is a company that has had historical debts since the beginning of the century, essentially. It had issues with paying pension benefits to its staff, and all of these problems, since as early, I think, 2002, 2001, have never been solved to date. Its reserves keep coming more and more negative. Its working capital is also negative. This is a firm that the Auditor General of Kenya said in 2019 is basically insolvent and can only continue operating while relying on the government for funds.
Yes.
That is already a very big challenge there for a parastatal that should be able to run by itself. And then now you have to enter into other challenges, such as now over-reliance on the government delaying in paying bills or rent to Postal Corporation of Kenya. And it is a myriad of problems that it's very hard to see how they can solve it as one-off. And it reminds me of Kenya Airways, because unless there's a huge bailout at once and a drastic change in how they operate business,
yes,
they will continue struggling. They will continue seeing auctioneers, as we saw a couple of years back, coming to their offices, taking away their chairs and their property because they're in debt and they're not generating enough revenue to pay their costs.
Justin, just before I cross over to George, because then you've not really then responded to that question that I asked you. I mean, there's a long list of parastatals that are heavily non-performing right now. Justin, I mean, we can't say of anything of the government's stake in the sugar industry. That is already done and dusted. We can go on with other companies that are in government purview that are not performing. KQ is one of them. You've seen exactly what is happening to state universities now, public universities. I mean, some of them are down on their knees as we speak now, Justin. Question then being, I mean, should they let Posta go? Because what we do know, in the financial year 2022, some of them have been earmarked for bailout. All the way from Nairobi University, KQ as well is in line as well. Kenya needs a government bailout. Now, Posta needs a government bailout. Some state universities like Moi University and Nairobi University need government bailout. That is going to be hard, especially when it comes to managing this public debt, which the government is promising to manage. But if they keep on bailing out these parastatals, it means that that would also run out of hand, which therefore begs the question, is privatizing, which also seems very hard for the government, by the way, Justin, should they just let these institutions go?
Again, your question is not as simple as you may make it sound, because we are relying on just the information we have access to.
Yes.
So on one hand, there are clear failures in the government in most of these corporations. It's very easy to generalize and say the government clearly doesn't know to run any sort of business other than revenue collection business. And by that logic, we say that all of them should be privatized, all of them should be sold to the private sector. At the same hand, you also have in a company like Kenyans, which has been performing in more or less a stellar way. It seems more like an exception than the norm at this point, but you can't generalize. That's my point.
Yes.
And on whether Posta should be closed. Now, this is again a complicated question, because in my view, they have so much assets, they have so much reach, they have so much in terms of, how will I say, reach, nationwide access, that if this was properly turned around and managed to the point that any small business that wants to import something from China, they know the best way to do it is through Posta, and they capture all that market. We have a lot of people going to small companies that are importing in Eastleigh, in town, in Nairobi, and if the government can be able to capture this sort of market, then you can see a way back for Posta. As it stands, it is struggling to go that direction, but the very biggest challenge that they should deal with right now is how to ensure that they are not insolvent, how to ensure that historical negative positions from a couple of decades back do not become a recurring story up to the end of this century.
Pretty much. Justin, let me pick the thoughts of George this morning. And I remember last year, I don't remember who that we had on the show who said, should we decide that as from tomorrow, Posta is dead, would that be the end of the Kenyan economy as we know of it? That question was actually raised, and the answer or the general concession was no, we'll find ways. George, is that what you're saying, that indeed, if all these parastatals then require government bailout, the government is trying to manage public debt, over the other hand, government parastatals also failing and they need this bailout from the government, what should be the next way for Posta?
Elijah put this businessman in town. In fact, make the worst business entities around. If you look at all the government entities that you can count around, even in industries that other players are making a lot of money, Elijah, government entities return negatives, Elijah. Remember, Posta initially was Kenya Post and Telecommunication Corporation, meaning they were not only doing parcel deliveries or letter, but they also in telecommunication. And Safaricom came and I think hived part of it, and then Telecom was hived again, and then they remained with now the other side. And you can see what Safaricom has done in the market, and you can clearly see what Safaricom has done through innovation, through new product deliveries. Posta has remained where they were when we were in primary school, unfortunately, Elijah, delivering of letters and parcels, which is a long gone business model. Remember, Elijah, business models change year in, year out. The business that you're doing today, the way you're doing it today, Elijah, will not be the same way you are going to do it tomorrow. So if you have to rely on what you're doing today to survive tomorrow, then most probably you are going to shut down. And that is what has affected Posta as we see it today. That company has a lot of potential. It only needs to remodel its business so that it can return value to its shareholder. You can see what let me just mention this. You can see what Send is doing in the market, and that is basically the business that Posta should be in.
Yes.
Delivery of parcels from point A to point B. They have the infrastructure. They have all what it takes to do that business. But what have they done? They have remained doing what they were doing in the 1990s. They cannot survive with that model in the current environment. And if they were not being bailed out by the government, Elijah, and as Justin has said, that company is technically insolvent. It cannot be able to pay its obligation through its revenue.
Yes.
It has to get funding able to pay its obligation. Elijah, the only way for some of these corporations, I'm not free to sit with the, is it called the Privatization Commission? I know some of these companies have been marked for privatization. The only challenge has been the bureaucracies and the Privatization Act that has not been able to lay out the roadmap for some of these companies to be offloaded from government books. Otherwise, I think maybe the government can hold just a few very critical sectors in the economy. For example, power, just put it, and maybe the road network. But a bulk of these companies should be offloaded through privatization. I want to give you an example of East African Portland Cement. That industry, the cement industry, Elijah, the private players in that industry are making money, but EAPC is not making money year in, year out. What does that tell you? It tells you that the problem is not with the market. The problem is with the management and running of those corporations. So in short, Elijah, for me, if I was sitting in Treasury,
yes,
then I would fast track privatization of some of these corporations, bring in that money to Treasury and allocate it better in other viable projects that the government wants to run. It doesn't make sense, Elijah, if you're a business person, that you can lose money for 10, 20 years and you still hold on to that business. It doesn't make any economic sense. So that is my position.
Pretty much. Justin, just 1 minute just before we take this short break. You hear exactly what George is saying, that indeed take that money and use it for other profitable business you can actually get into as a government. Look at the proposals that Kobo is proposing, reduce the board members and ask for government bailout. But the business remains the same, Justin. You can bail them out right now, but they're not going to compete with companies like Sandy, delivery companies now that are operating in that space that are doing efficient business than they are, Justin. So is it government bailout, give them 5 years again, and then government bailout? In a minute, if you can, Justin.
No. It's government bailout, business remodel, and new direction for the company. You cannot just bail out. It's like putting a bandage on a bullet wound. You cannot just bail out a company, you return it to zero, it goes to negative, you turn it to zero. You can't keep doing that. You have to bail it out, yes, because it's a government institution. It has dues to former staffers. It has many different properties across the country that all these Kenyan citizens are working in, and they need to be paid their salaries. We need their debt to be paid.
Yes.
But going forward, once you've been bailed out and you're at zero, okay, what do we do now to ensure we don't go back to the same position? To ensure that we do not dig into the government's coffers, which is essentially taxpayers' money, to go and pay for someone's mismanagement. So then we see, is there any real possibility for us to remodel while still being under the ownership and control of the government and still turn this around and make a profit? If there is no way, only then, in my view, do I see that then we need to go the privatization route. Only then. And we go the privatization route, it always sounds like this is something that will magically make everything okay. A private company, maybe the best manager of all, could take this over, private individual or group, and they eventually find out that this business could not make it all together. Privatization is usually as a result of the government maybe not being able to handle a company.
Yes.
Take it to the private sector. It's not. it won't run for many years, 7 years, as you said, in losses. So I feel there is a step between government bailout and privatization, and only because he has so much assets, so much property that for me, I'm afraid privatization may mean a lot of these assets being sold and maybe at a loss because they don't make sense to the farm, a lot of job losses, and eventually may not be end up in the green.
Pretty much. All right. I'm getting informed that that's actually all the time that we have for this conversation this morning. We can take the conversation online at Metropole TV KE across all your social media platforms and at www.metropoletv.co.ke. George, thank you very much for making time this morning, sir.
Thank you.
And to you, Justin MWANGI, as well. Thank you very much for making time.
Thank you very much for
Fantastic. My name is Dr Joseph Njoroge. This is Business AM, but most certainly Metropole Television. Good morning.